it's in the simplest way. I mean, if you just look at the priorities of the incoming administration, and they prioritize fossil fuel. And this was something that I think there was a combination of just personal feelings as far as what offshore wind meant, that it was, competing too much with fossil fuel, and then culturally, just the idea of it. So yeah, there was, I don't think there's anything that I can say that's different than what's been reported in the media about how this administration has looked at offshore wind. I think that I think they were careful enough, to try to carve out, some leeway for those projects that were already permanent, things like that. But yeah, I think it's kind of general knowledge now as to the priorities of this administration. But another question?
I just want to add, but you just covered it. I have a 6-level analysis of the rationale, a potential rationale of everything behind that executive order.
Yeah.
And none of the rationales have any validity, any more validity than any of the speculation that you just presented.
Yeah.
So,
I think, and again, I think that I don't think it's, when I just looking at the scope here, I would say, like I said, I mean, I think if I was gonna prioritize it, I would look at just monitoring to see if something changes, because this is what it is. And just understanding that that's part of the analysis too, I think, is how I've laid out a number of different statutes. And again, it's, for you just to have for reference, how it could impact a specific question. But if you look at what makes it so complicated is that these are very real sources of authority. The executive order, once that's issued, that goes into place as goes into force as soon as it's issued. So these have far-reaching effect. They don't, they're not statute. They're not, they are the interpretation of the White House and the orders from the president. But it has that same effect in a way, because it does cause industry to react or to prohibit or to allow. I mean, so it's something just as a source of authority to consider.
Well, we heard in the prior talk, from the state of Washington, that the governor withdrew their, work on wind due to economic concern.
Yeah.
Of the, versus, I guess, alternatives in the state of Washington that were reasonable and at a lower cost, perhaps. And
Yeah.
I was wondering if there was some deeper study behind all this.
I don't know about the study side of it, but it's impacting the East Coast. That is something that on the East Coast is really impactful. Yeah.
in theory, this is calling for that study.
Yeah, there is some support, but you're right, and that's a good point. And when I read that as well, this is something that does support that, yeah. Very busy slide here, but again, these are resources for you to look at. So this is just to show you the number of MOUs, MOAs that have come into force, that lay out these are really helpful. You can see they go back, 2011. This is back when Boehmer was around, but they're still very helpful in understanding, because within these the agencies lay out their authorities, they lay out the other agencies' authorities, and then they explain how they're going to work together. So there's a number of these. I've gone through. I mean, they're really helpful. And then at the end, I thought these were really helpful guidance documents too. This is the BOEM for guidelines on regulation of marine and hydrokinetic energy projects on the OCS, and then the one after that, guidelines related to renewable energy on the OCS. So once again, these are just guidance documents. Maybe they go into a folder somewhere that you can cite to later. But just to show you also that you're not starting from scratch, that's these agencies going back several years, they have identified this need to go through this process, and getting to an MOA is not so easy. So it shows you that they did want to reach some consensus. Usually it's born out of conflict, where the agencies have realized that they try to regulate the same issue, or they try to respond to something, and they identified that they need to have a more streamlined process to do this. And then lastly, to inform the public of how the public can understand what the rules are, and this is, I'm not sure there very well could be more than this, but this is just to give you a sample of the ones that I pulled this presentation here, to show you, what the federal government's been doing. Okay. So that's, just your intro, law course on statutory, and regulatory and legal authorities in the offshore context. Very dense, I know, but again, this is just meant for you to have as a resource later. And to let you know, what potential, why it's complex for the public to, why is it, difficult, to go and to invest in these projects? Who do you go to for what part, how do you communicate with the federal government? For your purposes here, I just wanted, to help you then through this committee work, when you get questions, when you sit around and you start to identify the points that you want to raise in your report. This is how I approach questions of jurisdiction. So just to start, so what is jurisdiction? This is the government's power to exercise legal authority when it comes to so what's the law? What's the regulated activity, and what's the location? So if you start with these three, then you can really help, kind of sift through all the noise and really get to what you're trying to address. So what do I mean by these three factors? So what's the substantive law? So if you're looking at a specific activity, let's just use floating wind. So what are the substantive laws that apply to that type of activity? And that law can either prohibit something or it can allow it, it could require some type of affirmative conduct. But really just just first understanding what law applies here. Next one. And along those lines then is this idea of what's the regulated activity looking at? So is it, we talked about this previously, so is it a device? Is it an installation? Is it a vessel? Is that registered someplace? Does it have a flag state? Is it for commercial purposes, research? Is it a public use or defense type? All of these have real legal meaning, and will help then, once again, narrow it even further into what you're actually trying to have that conversation on. Next. And I think this one is just as important as the other two, but really a critical starting point here. So the location. So where is this? Because this is really what will drive a lot of that authority that we talked about. So if we look at internal waters, we're talking about waters that are landward of the baseline. The baseline, if you just kind of drew a line around the coast near shore, that's essentially, I'm not going to get into the technical definition of it, but really then that's also where you begin to measure the territorial sea. This is, really important to understand is that the territorial sea, as we talked about, for states on the West Coast, that's going to be 3 nautical miles for state waters. Some federal statutes still refer to the territorial sea as 3 nautical miles. And some refer to it at 12 nautical miles. So just to say it's in the territorial sea is not enough. You really have to look at what the statute says and what it's referring to in that context. I put the UN Convention Law of the Sea up here in President's Proclamation because the US has declared a territorial sea out to 12 nautical miles, and internationally, under customary international law, countries can recognize out to 12 nautical miles. That doesn't mean that every agency has updated their statutes now to call the territorial sea 12 nautical miles. I don't want to get too much, further into this, but just to say, just be aware that's a huge difference in terms of where siting can be for these different projects. The contiguous zone, then goes from 12 to 24 miles. That's limited to customs, fiscal matters, immigration, sanitation. I'm on time.
Well, here, a little over.
Oh, okay, this is the last slide, I think.
You're on the EEZ as far as.
Yeah, sorry, so, economic zone, the EZ, 200 nautical miles, which is essentially the same as the continental shelf. And then beyond that, you're getting into high seas. Once again, high seas, some statutes consider high seas to be beyond 12 nautical miles and some beyond 200.
So the continental shelf isn't an oceanographic term, it's just a horizontal measurement.
But this is the last one, so you get one picture. Okay, so this is just to break it down, so regular, yes, so that is a legal term. And it does apply out. I mentioned that there are extended continental shelf ideas, but I don't want to get into that here. So you can just see here, just to break down, where the, zones are. I think that's the last one.
Usually the continental shelf goes to a distance offshore that's 200 meters bottom depth.
It's defined in the, Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. If you look there, there's kind of how that's where I would start when you start to analyze that. So, I'm sorry, I did go over, sorry about that, but I don't know if we have any kind of question, but.
Thank you, Sean.
Alright.
You have any? Yeah,
Curious, does the Chevron deference opinion have a large impact on what agency interpret law to mean?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So essentially, it does in the context if a decision was decided on the Chevron doctrine, which is essentially this idea that agencies are granted deference by the courts in making their determination. It's a little more narrow than originally thought, and I don't know of any cases that have challenged the offshore. There very well could be, I just don't know. Renewable energy or offshore wind based on Chevron doctrine. But it's something that there's a few cases that came out around that time that certainly if the, a party wanted to challenge them, that, that there very well could be something that.
There are discussions at the moment about changing the way that harm is defined in the Endangered Species Act.
Yeah.
Which could have fairly large implications in terms of habitat impacts of offshore renewable energy. Be able to comment on those at all?
I haven't heard that. Where is that developing from?
From the federal government. So there's a move to change the way that NIMS and Fish and Wildlife Service had interpreted harm to include ecological impacts and habitat impacts that lead to take.
It more relates to comes both with consultation and takings of endangered species. Because one of the things it wasn't really discussed, but one of the things that listing triggers is the designation of critical habitat. And so the harm definition by regulation, which actually went up to Supreme Court many years ago, and there was some, I think Chevron deference was applicable in that decision, related to the definition that if you disturb habitat, which then has potential impacts on behavioral characteristics of the species, or on life cycle of the species, it could be considered then to be a taking, or under the consultation provisions, you have to consult and say that there's either no jeopardy to the species or no destruction of habitat considered to be critical. So it could come into play if that definition is changed.
Yeah. So, short answer is I haven't heard that, but I'm not surprised in the context of this as emerging issue and looking at new ways to interpret it. So, but I haven't heard anything on that.
Did I hear correctly that when you asked the question about the executive order that the administration made in January 20th, that the latter part of that sentence, which I can't even read my writing, but provide some substance for the committee? Is that your justification? Is it?
I was just pointing out that so this was just to focus on the sources of authority that could impact your analysis. And just to say that, just to continue to monitor executive orders if a new one comes out, that whether that's withdrawn or changed.
I'd just like to add to that, I think that language provides a great opportunity.
Oh, yeah,
That's what I was
sorry.
curious about.
Whether or not that opportunity is gonna actually be afforded is another question.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Mike, Armand?
Yeah, hi. Thanks. Enjoyed the presentation, and this kind of piggybacks on the question that you were just asked. We've had, what now, 3 solicitors' opinions in the last 4.5 years, from December of 2020, on that section 8P4, the one that talks about prevention of reasonable uses. You know, right now that's being interpreted a way that was different than it was prior to, I believe it was April of this year. To what level of credence should we give the solicitor's opinion on that specific section when we're looking at sort of forming content for our document? Because that, you know, that seems to stand for that any prevention of a reasonable use should not be supported, which would change sort of the tenor of our report noticeably from where it was, in March of this year.
I don't know that off the top of my head. I haven't reviewed that. So I don't know about the substance of that document. I would say that for the committee's purposes, and in terms of a legal opinion from the Solicitor General, whoever it is, which agency was that? Was that DOJ?
Interior. It was Interior.
Department of the Interior.
Okay, so DOI's interpretation, yeah, so I think the main takeaway with that is 2 things, whatever is the most recent, whatever that most recent interpretation is what you have to go on. Second is when you look at the broader implication for investments in this space, is that if, when you mentioned there were multiple interpretations over several years, that's a complexity that for the industry that's challenging, because you could have a change in that interpretation in 3 years from now. And so that's part of this entire offshore world that's really been challenging, as you probably know. So that's how I would interpret it. I don't know the substance of that. I have to look at it closer. I'm sorry about that, but that's how I would look at it as far as what it means to the committee.
Yeah, no, thanks. I think the political ping pong with the solicitor's opinions is something that we have to be mindful of going forward, because as you just alluded to, in 3 years, it could be something totally different.
Yeah.
Just a quick one for everyone's benefit here. Could you talk a little bit about BOEM and Bessie and where those 2 overlap? I know when we were going through our process, it was a confusing, a web of which agency assumes responsibility where and what.
Yeah, we may be better off waiting for
the next.
Yeah.
I'll give you, I can give you the short answer.
There's that, but then I also, just to go to the slide, there is a slide that if you pull up, the MOA on it is a really good, let's see what the MOAs are. And I'll let you comment.
I was just gonna say the short answer, and maybe it'll simplify like a lot of these issues. BOEM does the leasing and the planning approval. Bessie does the operational oversight. There's a phase in there where BOEM does the approval of the construction operations plan that involves a lot of Bessie activity, because they have to then execute the implementation of that construction operations plan. So it does get very confusing right there.
For Deepwater Horizon, and all, we're Bessie.
I'm sorry?
I think that's after Deepwater Horizon, right?
Well, the split occurred as a result of Deepwater Horizon, but as far as the renewable, wind energy regulations go. That's basically it, is that planning, leasing and planning is BOEM, and then operations is BESI oversight.
And I think that this last guidelines here, I think that's the one that it gives a really good breakdown of the various agencies. And there very well could be a BOEM, BESI, MOA, I just didn't put that here.
There is, it was a long time coming.
Yeah, well, that's, yeah, so
You got
they're,
two federal agencies deciding what, who's got what territory.
But- they're really well, yeah, I think that they do a very good job of describing it. So I think this last one, if I'm not mistaken, does a good job of breaking down some of that, that I can also look at.
Great, thank you, Sean. Take a quick 5-minute break.
In fact, I think quite recent, he's going to speak on the offshore renewable energy regulatory process. Jim?
Okay, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate being here to speak at the National Academies, again, and, I also appreciate being some old friends from back east, Firestone, Brian Penoyer, who goes back, not only back east, but back decades, as they know, at Interior. We've heard some very good presentations from tribal perspective, from the state perspective, and just now, Sean, from the legal perspective. I'm gonna provide you a little bit of federal perspective. I'm retired from the federal government after 43 years, dealing primarily with horizontal shelf activities, federal land management issues. And I'm also, I was the program manager for the offshore renewables program for 7 or 8 years before I retired. I'm also going to give you more of an East Coast perspective, because as the program grew, everything was really focused on the East Coast and the actual development activity that occurred there. My opinions and information, a lot of which is from BOEM, does not represent policy of the BOEM or the current administration. I don't want to repeat a lot of what you've already heard, but I'm not going to repeat it if the slides don't move forward.
We have to ask for it to be advanced.
It's actually running off of my computer, board, my page down. Nothing's working.
Would you like me to pull it up?
Sorry?
Do you want me to pull it up?
Yeah, what you're gonna pull up is the PDF, which is basically all the same information about the sexy animation.
Oh, I transferred it to PowerPoint.
Oh,
Hold on.
all right. Most of you are already familiar with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is the agency I worked with as a program manager, has 4 regional offices, and I'm sure you're familiar with the Pacific office as well as the Washington office, aside from the Washington office, which oversees the program. The OCS Lands Act, as was mentioned by Sean, is what gave BOEM the authority to move forward with energy other than oil and gas. The program prior to the OCS Lands Act was essentially the oil and gas program in the Gulf of Mexico, with efforts to develop elsewhere, but primarily in the Gulf of Mexico, where more than 25% of domestic production occurs. Next slide. 3 fundamentals for wind energy, of course, are the wind resource, a buildable environment, which has been a big factor on the East Coast, where there's conventional engineering in shallow waters. Not so much for the West Coast, but the technology for floating, of course, is coming around. We'll talk about that later at the next presentation. The third thing is markets. As you can see from the sky at night, you couldn't ask for better markets. You've got perfect winds, That's why the East Coast is growing the way it did and, we've been growing the way it has. But there's also, factors such as state involvement in terms of, energy goals, just renewables portfolios and specific wind targets, which you can see, up there on the, on states from Massachusetts down to the Carolinas. We also have, I think it's 3 gig for Oregon, 5 gig as a goal for California, as well as leasing out there. The second additional factor is technology. The next slide. Not to get into it, but you can see from this slide, the growth of the turbine has been very substantial over time, and it's important because as the diameter doubles, the power generated quadruples, and that makes it even more attractive for offshore wind. The far right, the one to the left of the World Trade Center there is typically what's being deployed now on the East Coast. And the one to the right of that is some research efforts, which moves into new technological areas. Aside from technology, all of it comes down to the next slide, which is the declining costs. Cost came down by 50%, which is colossal over the 20 teens, and then was in the process of coming down again by that same 50% over this current decade. All of which makes it more competitive. But that competition, I'm gonna come back to that because the law was set up, the OCS Lands Act talks about who's responsible for what. The law was set up for competitive practices for the private sector to get involved and for the private sector to develop these resources. The next slide, if you would. The other piece of the puzzle, the final piece of the puzzle on the East Coast that is colossal is the manufacturing, the supply chain development, the manufacturing, the academic programs, port developments that have occurred to the tune of $60 billion supply chain over the last few years. All of this is contained in the Code of Federal Regulation offshore, I don't know. what this-
It doesn't matter.
I think it's fixed, but offshore.
When we got the video, that was.
We were told there were no actual 15s, but not actually.
Wait, so we switched to PowerPoint or?
Oh.
Yeah, because they jumped right. to
What?
18. Union went, it's, I think you're 18.
Then just share that. Hold on, I just got service again.
Oh,
No, you're fine.
do you wanna,
Um,
you can stay off if you want.
But the problem is you're gonna have that leapfrogging. As the technology jumps, you're gonna have the implementation. There's been calls by both developers and some of the manufacturers, you know, this competition is getting larger and larger and larger. Working with the industry, we should be lowering costs on smaller turbine instead, but that's another.
Online computers again.
Okay, were we on it and we lost them? and then-
Because,
I lost service on my
Yeah.
computer, so it kicked me out of the.
connected to the.
Okay. All right, so, let's see, we can bump, one more slide. I'm not gonna go through issues. You're already familiar with all the issues. Next slide. Including commercial fisheries, tribal interests, the process. The process was designed to follow, the multi-decade process in the Gulf of Mexico for oil and gas. And it's basically to get to seal in the water, it's a 4-stage process of planning and analysis up front, which can take a couple of years. Leasing, which can take 1 to 2 years, 5 years or so of site assessment insofar as the developer needs it. A couple of years of construction and the operational activities going out to the extent of the lease, which is the early leases were about 28 years and are now running about 35. You get told that the equipment is gonna last a lot longer than we would for oil and gas. You're gonna see that, you saw this diagram earlier, and from Corey, next one if you would. This is a little bit more detailed. I'm not gonna bore you with all of the details other than to say the first 4 processes, through, site assessment and construction, are the same. All of that planning activity has a public component, has a public involvement of one sort or another, including tribal consultations, including the ESA consultations, including public hearings and the like. And then, after the operations term, decommissioning is included in the construction and operation. The big item here is the construction and operation plan. When BOEM approves that, it gives them authority to actually go out and build something. And that has some implications for some of the executive orders that we've seen. Questions on that as far as process is concerned?
Jim, just because we're talking about it, this is a bone process map. So understandably, it doesn't include other things, but the Coast Guard represents like a stage before 0, in which it defines navigational fairways. And just, I want to confirm my understanding for the committee that BOEM's process would take that into account and would avoid those areas. Is that correct?
That is correct. That's a good point. There's, leading up to, I was just gonna talk about, all the information that goes into, the process of identifying a lease area through planning and analysis, and then, to actually conduct a lease sale and an auction. Where do we get our information? Like Brian says, a lot of the information is already developed with this, particularly with regard to Coast Guard activities. But I do want to mention the environmental studies program, which is the next slide. But also throughout this process, which can take 6, 8, or 10 years, which is always confounding to me when we hear about how it's just too quick, it just happens too quickly. But if you can go to the next slide, please. We have a number of different sources. The process is built around the establishment of an intergovernmental state task force, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, which includes the the federal agencies, the state agencies, tribal, the affected tribes, and public is allowed to participate, much as this meeting is being held. It's open to the public, but it's not really a public meeting. But we'll talk about that in a minute. What are the sources of all the public input? Stakeholder engagement has changed a lot over the years. Next slide. But
Jim, we have a
Yes.
question. Can
Go for
we
it.
jump in? Mike?
Absolutely.
Do you
Go
have
ahead. Go ahead.
something to add?
Yeah, sorry. Oops, hold on. Let me get my video on. Yeah, sorry. Thanks for that. Just going back to when you were talking about the citing decision-making process, you inferred that there was a transparent process with a lot of public engagement. I think our experience on the West Coast is a little bit different in the sense that call areas came out of nowhere. I don't think anybody was aware of them except for, maybe the powers that be. But stakeholders, the fishing industry and the like, those were just dropped on us without much fanfare. So I'm just curious, how do we reconcile your statement that there was a lot of stakeholder outreach during this siting planning process and our experience on the West Coast where there was virtually none?
Okay, well, I'm not familiar with the details of the West Coast process of the last year, but I will note that there is opportunity and concerted effort to move towards that when we get to the call area. I am gonna walk through, if we are, assuming we have time, I'm gonna walk through the process specifically for the Gulf of Maine so that you can see where you get, how we get from the original planning area to the call area. And it's not real surprising to me that the call area, which is several steps away from a lease area, might not have been known to folks previously, but it should be and is designed to be an open and transparent process with very, very extensive stakeholder engagement.
Okay, thank you.
You can see the variety of meetings that we've had. I'm just gonna give you an anecdote as far as the development of these meetings. I go back to the oil and gas program and the environmental and the NEPA processes and the stakeholder meetings and public meetings, which were very, very rigid, very, very, okay, stand up, give you 3 minutes tops, talk, and we'll note it and we'll go on to the next speaker and we're not gonna answer any questions, to a much more open process over the course of the 20 teens and the 20 and now into the 2020s. That includes town halls and public meetings, and a lot of the substantive experts from BOEM are typically there and are able to have the dialogue with the people that are interested. So I think that's a step in the right direction, better process.
Jim,
Yeah.
just related to that, what do you think BOEM could do even better on community engagement? So, and I agree, the town halls and public meetings, that's a real advancement over, sort of just taking public comment and not engaging in any kind of dialogue. So where could they do better, both with sort of communities, commercial fishing interests and tribal governments? So
Yes,
that's sort of one of our, both those are sort of focal areas,
I'm a little hesitant to say anything because they may have already started it right up until January 20th. But those groups that you're mentioning, where BOEM might have the opportunity and the resources to actually be dealing with those specific divisions, commercial fisheries, southern New England, Massachusetts, but other groups as well. I think the very unfortunate situation on the Jersey coast where a lot of concerns and oppositions didn't get addressed as fully as they should have by the government. And that's kind of balancing, how much credence do you give to the parochial concerns versus substantive concerns, and where do you spend the resources? The other thing, of course, that has changed dramatically over the years is technology. We're able to do a lot more of this type of meeting, Zooms and public participation, as opposed to having to go to every single place that we are trying to get some.
Can I jump in now?
Sure.
So I'm gonna be a little bit critical of Bohm. Because, it seemed like as time went on, they became less interactive with particularly the Marine Planning Committee, that the Pacific Fisheries Management Council, and Corey's on that, and Mike Conroy. So, I started calling when Bohm would give a presentation, I refer to them as infomercials. Because they were very, very sanitized. They were kind of insulated from us. They'd have a facilitator who would start the meeting, and a person from Bohm would give a presentation. And then we very restrictive on how we could ask our questions. And we'd have to ask the question, the facilitator would then decide whether it's, go to Doug Boren or whoever to answer the question. They would give an answer, then we move on. And
I'm sorry, man.
so, it was very, very unsatisfactory, and we had very few. There's very little. I've had this much conversation with you right now. I haven't just about anybody involved across the table.
I think this thing that has, I mean, we're a long way from where we were 15, 20 years ago. I think it is the kind of process that's going to improve with time. And it's unfortunate if we've had these negative experiences, but I hope that we're in a situation where we'll build on those experiences in order to improve. I know the Alaska regions, of course, that's oil and gas, but their interaction with tribal entities, local jurisdictions has changed very dramatically over that same period of time. And it's necessary. It's necessary for that to change that way, or else we're not gonna have effective.
Yeah, so if it.
Again, not we.
So if and when it starts up again, they're gonna have to start over, a fresh start, and,
Well, this is all the whole, I'm gonna digress a little bit, but I think it's useful for folks. We started this process, I didn't get into it, 2005 was the Energy Policy Act, 2001 was the regulatory structure. We started having some interest in 2013, and everyone was thinking that this is a process in which there'd be one state that would be interested in doing something, and we'd have a small wind farm there. And then maybe from that, we learn open type of stakeholder involvement and a lot of other things. And another state would be interested, might want to have one there, and we incrementally improve throughout those experiences. And then in 2016, the program exploded with the New York sale, which is a project which is now owned by the wind. It was everything, everywhere, all at once. And there has been incremental improvements, but it hasn't progressed as steadily and as stably as it could.
and I'll say that it should have been easy for Bowl, because we have one ecosystem, even though there are 3 states, well, 4 states counting Idaho. But it's all the usual suspects. Those of us you see here in this room are pretty much the same ones you'll see at just about every event. And so it should have been much easier for Bowl to work with us primarily through those who were involved in the Pacific Council process, because you had the 3 state agencies, the commercial industry, all the treaty fishing tribes. Everybody is very accustomed and organized to work together, and it was just so frustrating. It was like, I mean, I'm kind of venting here, but it was, to me, it was like turning the clock back early in my career where the federal government said, "I go away, we don't want to bother with tribes." So,
I think all of the indications since then, have indicated we need to do, all needs to do, a better job, much more, insofar as possible, to improve the stakeholder input. And I hear what you're saying. I've heard the criticism before, And it resulted in substantial change. So I'm hoping that's the case here. Sorry.
Jeremy, do you have a question before?
I am.
Oh, okay.
Okay, you're good. Thank you for catching that. Let's see, who's involved in this overall process? Well, input from the Intergovernmental Task Force is the marine spatial planning efforts on the part of the state of Washington, the state of California, everyone. These are great assets that really ought to be exploited as we move into the process of identifying lease areas. Next slide. And who's involved here? Well, actually, the big question is who's not involved here. I've actually got a couple more on this very similar slide that was Sean showed you just a few minutes ago. And quite an array of federal authorities and federal agencies that are involved. The Empire Wind Project, back in the fall, received its last permit, 20 permits to move forward, and all of those involve some sort of process, maybe not as extensive as Bones, which is maybe wanting in some areas, but they all involve some process for public input. Next slide. I know it's a federal agency. This is an example for New York of the state agencies that are involved, either in commenting or in providing approvals for the project, which includes not just the federal jurisdiction, but also the state jurisdiction for landfalls, for transmission and the like. And of course, the next slide is tribal interests, which are expressed, and we got a real learning back around 2015 to 2016 about tribal interest, because the program was built on what was going on in the Gulf of Mexico, and the Gulf of Mexico is the Gulf of America. And in that Gulf, whatever you want to call it, there was no real tribal involvement, and partly because of the lack, partly because of the lack of direct coast. But we started to develop, and we now have, as we move forward with proposals, tribal consultations which are required. There's also interest, of course, from on the part of the tribes, protecting cultural resources. These are experiences on the East Coast. A strong interest in economic opportunities that might be associated with offshore wind. Obviously, environmental concerns and the sovereignty that's associated with tribal land. So it was a very different process for wind on the East Coast than was in the Gulf of Mexico. Next slide. Okay, I'm gonna walk you through the Gulf of Maine here with each of the steps that were executed. Starting with planning and analysis, and I want you to look, if you look at that diagram on your screen, you'll see that the first step in the process, planning area, and the last step is the identification of a specific lease offering or lease sale area. And it is a process of winnowing down based on the input that is received. First step for the planning area is typically, next slide, is typically a very large area, typically proposed by a state. That was what our experience was for both New York Bright Sales, as well as the Gulf of Maine, which also had a lot of input to identify the planning area, the largest area that would be taken into consideration. Throughout this process, the area we move forward with gets smaller. It never gets larger. Identifying the areas that can be decommissioned and that are most suitable with the least amount of conflict to move forward with an actual sale. That planning area and draft RFI was shared at the May 22 task force meeting at the Gulf of Maine. That led to the next step, which is next slide, which is the solicitation of input and identification the areas that were excluded from consideration, for very, say, concrete reasons, if you will. Either because they're part of the national park system or, the Coast Guard and all of this prior work has identified navigation channels, they're just taken off the table. In this case, unsolicited reach request area was, not included in that, request for interest. Sure.
So what's so great about this is that it was multi-state. It's like an ecosystem that built Maine, so there was no administrative or like barrier to that approach, as you think, right?
No, you're right. In this particular case, it was actually initiated by of all, the state of New Hampshire. We had our first meeting, I was still in the position at the time, in New Hampshire, at the beginning of March before COVID broke out, which was a great spirit. That included both the states of Maine and of Massachusetts, which is very nice in this case because it's pretty well defined, so fine. I guess like you have out here on the West Coast, but maybe even more focused out here on the West Coast. But it did include, yeah, all three affected states. That's the way the task force is set up.
Jim Green was on. Yeah, no, I just want to point out something to the committee members, you're looking at this, you'll notice that off of the major ports, BOEM has ruled out the circular traffic separation schemes and the offshore fairways. You'll see the big one coming out of Massachusetts, but nothing in Maine. That's because I think up until the West Coast, the Coast Guard, because there wasn't a lot going on except in the Gulf of Mexico, it only did its port access route studies port by port. It didn't do the regional structure that you're talking about. Which is why you don't see connecting fairways here, which I imagine was a tremendous problem for you guys.
Yeah, well, which was the case with the Mid-Atlantic study, if I remember correctly. But yeah, so insofar as you gave us information, anyway, the RFI excluded these areas and the RFI went out to determine, I'm coming back to the competition issue of the law, to determine whether or not there was competitive interest in moving forward in this area. And that's what the RFI area distributed. When, if you look back at that diagram, you'll see public meetings, consultation, et cetera, at each stage in this process. And the process, big red box on the top, shows you where we are, what the area looks like. You can go to the next slide. And with the input that we received in discussions with NOAA and others, the areas were reduced. After incompatible areas were removed, the draft call was just 27%, or reduced by 27% from the initial area. Next slide. Final call areas, after the draft call areas went out, that's when we select, BOEM asks for input, and some additional areas are removed. In this case, George's Bank was removed because of its ecological sensitivity and value for commercial fisheries. Next slide. After that, we moved to, and it's not required, it's not written down that it has to be a wind energy area, but the next step is to go to a draft wind energy area, which was about a 64% reduction from what was provided in the call. And this was broken into two stages. The next step, the area ID process, reduced it again based on fisheries concerns and high voltage, AC compatibility, another 43%. So we're down 80% of the area that was identified in the call. And then finally, after the consultations and activities on that process, a proposed sale area, next slide. Next slide. Proposed sale area is identified. and this breaks it into the areas that are gonna be offered for lease. And, I'm gonna mention something because it's been brought up a couple times about decision-making and, is it as transparent as it ought to be? And again, I think that's something that the Bureau is working on. We instituted a process of providing a decision memorandum, on some of these decisions that were made. And it became available. In some cases, it became widely available. In other cases, it wasn't quite so well known. Keep that in mind as you move through this process. It's not required, but it's an effort to be more transparent and to explain why certain areas were included and certain areas were excluded. It doesn't necessarily mean that the decision is simply removing every area that somebody might have a concern about. It means that some decision criteria was applied, and the policymakers have made a decision as to what the sale area should be. So this proposed sale notice is followed up with a final sale notice, which identifies who is interested in bidding and when the auction will be held. It's an online auction, and in this particular case, there were several takers. And how are we doing on time?
Okay.
All right, let's go. So using this process, we've now got, I think it's 30 leases on the east, in the Northeast. You can advance. And you'll see that, there are projects in the works up and down the East Coast, some of which have gone well, some of which have not gone well. But the point is that there's 20, there were 16, I think, approved construction and operations plan in my last check. And there are a number more that have been submitted, and some that are still pending. And they are reflected in various projects. And if we have time, I'll go through a couple of projects to give you an idea of where we are on things. Just a couple, not all of the projects, but the first one, next slide, is the coastal Virginia offshore wind project. It's 2 turbines off of Virginia Beach. It's only 2 turbines, which is even smaller than the first offshore project, which was a state project, Block Island in Rhode Island. Same turbine size. It was a prototype for Dominion Energy, which is built upon that to start the project that I'll talk about at the end in just a minute. But it's 2 turbines, and it's generating electricity. And I would note that was a process in which we had to make some adjustments to the regulatory structure because we sequenced certain requirements for submission, as-built and the like, in a way that really wasn't compatible with an effective implementation and commissioning of the wind turbine. And that's the learning that goes on through the process that enables us to move forward. Vineyard Wind, I mentioned before, has got was going in next slide. I think it had a commissioning date of 2005, which obviously is not going to occur, or maybe it was 2004. 2004. But they ran into several difficulties, including some mechanical failures with blades. And as a result, they're behind schedule, but they are moving forward. They've got 4 turbines installed and expected, and are doing more as we speak. Ocean Wind is a project off of New Jersey. Next slide. And that's a project that has now been put on the shelf. They could not maintain the agreement with the state of New Jersey for delivery of the product of the electricity, and costs went up, and they backed out at this point. Next slide. Empire Wind was the first project, that little pie-shaped piece there in the New York Bight. That was the project in 2016 that saw the first huge increase in royalty bids from a few $100,000 to $1 million and $2 million, it went for $42 million. Now, there's other factors involved there, such as the market that it's serving, and the developer that was involved in it. This is the project that recently, was subjected to a stop work order by the administration. And according to them, they were losing 50 million a week because they were already, this was a project that was approved, had its construction operation plan approved. They were building and, it was costing them about $50 million a week. And they were out of commission for about a month. And this results in some souring of the market, if you will, making the industry a little less attractive. So the changes that are, I'm just gonna make the pitch. We talk about all the things that go on. I think one of the most detrimental things that it's hurting the offshore wind industry, is that the 180-degree turnarounds that we have with the changes in administration. The Congress decided and the president approved when they did the Energy Policy Act, following the program to Gulf of Mexico, that competitive bids and private sector risk are going to be the factors that will decide what goes forward and moves forward within appropriate environmental safeguards and appropriate engagement. We haven't had that. We haven't had that for quite a while. It took the first Trump administration a couple of years before they said, look, we don't want any more leasing. And then we did a 180 when the next administration took over and provided very substantial subsidies and made it very, very attractive, maybe more attractive than it was really economically feasible. And now we've done another 180 and gone back to zero. So all of that has a dampening effect on the development of the of offshore. I do want to mention, well, let's go to the last example that I'm going to give you, and that's the follow-up to the first one, which was the Coastal Virginia offshore wind 2 turbine project. They are now building a 2.6 megawatt wind farm off of Virginia Beach. And the next slide, you can see some of the facilities, transition pieces that are going to the turbines offshore. I think it's 170 of the turbines. It may not be the biggest offshore wind farm in the world, but it's close. It's certainly the largest in the US. So it is happening, is my point. I do want to mention back on our work with the tribes. I think our experience on the East Coast had a couple of factors. One, we touched on earlier today, and that's the lack of resources. Now, it's not just tribes that have this problem, but groups in general, and for example, commercial fisheries, are stretched to provide the kind of reviews that are necessary to make sure that their interests are advanced. And the other thing I think that we learned from there, it doesn't get solved just by having a lot more meetings. It is a real issue with meeting fatigue, because there's so many things going on that the effective participation is hampered, is hurt as a result of just throwing more and more meetings out there. In light of all of the things that are going on. We had a number of tribes that were involved in our experience from Cape Wind, which did not go forward, and as well as the follow-up sale of Massachusetts. And I might mention we had the Massachusetts sale. We had 2 areas that we had 3 areas offered. Now, 4 areas offered, 2 of them, nobody bid on. 2 years later, 2 areas were split into 3 areas, and all 3 of them went for $135 million apiece. So that gives you an idea of the level of interest in offshore wind. And then that was followed, of course, by the second New York Bight sale, which had 5 or 6 leases, I think it was, one of which was $1.1 billion. And I signed that lease, and my hand was shaking, and I thought getting 3 kids through college was costly. That lease indicated a commitment on the part of industry to be moving forward. And it also indicated a need on the part of the government to make sure that these things are done right, so that we don't get into a situation right now. So, I think that's all I had to offer you, and if there's any questions, well, there you go. Thank you very much.
We do have a few minutes, thank you, Jim, a few minutes for questions if there's any. Right.
Jim, I wonder if you, we suffered through a bunch of Administrative Procedure Act joy together. Appreciate you distinguishing how things used to be, and I just sort of become much more dialogue and engagement oriented. I wonder, you know, when I think about all the legal frameworks that are coming to bear, they're all slightly different on how the decision and engagement processes work. Kind of stepping back from where you went to the highest altitude, if you're gonna change these group of processes, what one thing would you think is the most important for the process to enhance?
Well, I've already mentioned it, and that's that, I don't know how to really characterize it, but I think the legislator, I won't come back to the second thing, but the first thing I want to mention is that what I already mentioned. I think the legislation made it clear that this is not something that should be a political football, although how do you not make it a political football? That the private sector, through due process with environmental safeguards and proper stakeholder engagement, should be able to be moving forward. And I think making the decisions more durable, and I'm not talking about just the situation we have right now, I'm talking about just in general, to make decisions that are made by the government more durable so that the industry knows that they've done the right thing so far as it is possible, and has everybody on board as they move forward. The other thing is that the one thing I would change is probably making the stakeholder engagement processes more
Their sovereignty. And how do you engage them specifically? What's your thoughts?
well. The formal steps are ensuring that we have specific consultation activities with the tribe. They'll meet with the tribes and sit down and make sure that their interests are heard and are addressed. I'm not saying that they necessarily would be adopted, they should be fully addressed through a formal consultation process formal government to government consultation process. I can't speak, I'm not trying to prescribe what goes on in the Pacific because the program is designed nationally, but it's implemented regionally. So, I don't know, what specific recommendations, but I do think that the goal is, would be, under any kind of normal circumstances, open to processes that are, more inclusive, more informed, behavior.
And somehow, BOEM needs to ensure compliance with treaties and how they go about that. Not clear yet.
I think that's a good observation. I think there's efforts to be more inclusive and consult more, but maybe some specific requirements. And I think I was very interested in the comment that was made earlier about the OCS Lands Act and the Coastal Zone Management Act, how they both kind of slow play the interaction with tribes. That's a fair characterization, but and some serious question and deliberation and decision as to whether and what form that would take. You're literally talking about an act of Congress, so there's some real factors involved. But that could be one of the ways in which tribal involvement is to strengthen the improve our system.
Okay, good, Jeremy.
Yeah, so I've got a question sort of along the line of Brian Keats and so. And what struck me was one of the very first things you said in your presentation, that this was designed to follow the four-stage process of oil and gas.
Not quite.
But I'm paraphrasing, but and it goes back in part to the whole design of the Energy Policy Act of 2005, because energy markets for electricity are a lot different than oil and gas. And risks are a lot different. Not that there aren't risks, but there are, the risks are different. There's not the risk of catastrophic spills. We also know that all the money goes into the treasury. So, and we know that, on the tribal side, that maybe we should be thinking about more along the lines of co-management. And because of the way energy markets are structured, maybe we'd be better off with a state first program where the federal government's role was only in the ultimate leasing of the space, but that they didn't sort of start out, but rather the states sort of decided if they wanted to move in that direction. So the big questions are, how might, and we understand this would have to go to Congress, but we are a congressionally mandated study as well. How might we have a better law that better serves the country and better serves the interests of all?
Good question, good point. I will say first off, on that your observation about the industry, yes, it's very, very different. Oil and gas is a commodity that can be stored and distributed as desired. Electricity, despite improvements in storage capability, electricity is basically what's being consumed and it's generated. And that makes the markets different, so that, and more risk associated. That's why the developers need to go to the state to get off the convention. And I would say that as the process moves forward and they start experiencing these things, unless a state was interested in moving forward, even though the authority for leasing jurisdiction rests with the federal government, nothing's going to go forward with the state as proposed. We've done several 180s on the state level. The state as well. So that is a factor. And then as far as revenue is concerned, that's a good question. They developed revenue sharing for oil and gas in the Gulf of Mexico. It's, the money that is generated from the federal OCS belongs to all the people, and therefore it just goes into the general treasury. It doesn't go to industry development, it doesn't go to stakeholders, it doesn't go to impacts, it doesn't go to studies. Maybe that money could be used more effectively if it was devoted to some other particular good. Not to say that the money just disappears when it goes into the general treasury, but maybe it just disappears. So I think on that front, state first, I think the state basically has that capability now. They're not interested in having revenues is something that can be developed, but it needs to be developed over time and it's going to require.
On the states do go first, but what we have is developers bidding for space versus bidding for lowest price to,
As far as the federal.
yeah, so you basically, the way the program works is we create effectively oligopolists in the ocean who then go to the states, and the states then have a limited number of potential bidders rather than companies first coming to states and bidding for the lowest and best and most engaged project. And then the states would sort of figure out which one that was, and then they would go to the federal government and say, okay, we've got this and we want to do this project. Where's a good space?
Yeah, well, you're asking a question that was, there's a chicken and an egg argument in a lot of ways. Because, the federal government is going nowhere with the leasing program as we did back in the days of what we referred to as imaginary energy program. When we were offering leases and nobody was bidding on them, bidding really very small amounts of money. The point is that the states and the federal government have got to work together to have a successful project. It's not going to happen if a particular state is not willing to move forward with it. That approach that you described is similar in some ways to what they do over in Europe. We've got other things going on over lend themselves more to that. I don't know. I thought that I lost, but I must have answered the question.
And we do have time for one last question.
This is kind of two-parted, but, in your experience there with these operating, wind turbines, what percent of the time are they able to produce adequate electricity to meet the needs of the contracts?
I'm not the engineer or the economist, but my understanding, and I'm not sure what you mean by adequate, but my understanding is basically they're spinning all the time. The idea that they stop spinning because there's no wind, they're generating something, but it's not the same amount, it fluctuates
Right.
dramatically. So 100% of the time, essentially.
Okay, and what I meant is, okay, what percent of the time are alternate energy sources need to be brought online?
Alternate meaning other than offshore.
Right, yeah.
Well, that gets into a larger picture that I think is, we talk about the energy transition, which is in many people's mind, the idea that we're going to, like we flip a switch and go from, fossil fuels to, offshore wind or onshore wind, renewable energy, that's not gonna happen. What my opinion is, studying it over time, is that over time, you're going to have a fluctuating mix of conventional sources, maybe nuclear, and renewable sources, solar, wind, and they're going to combine, and as much, low impact offshore wind energy that can be generated is going to reduce the amount of necessary fossil fuel farming in order to meet energy demand, which is going up in very, very big ways. No single source of energy is going to satisfy the demand for energy over time. So, to answer your question, the idea that we're gonna say, okay, 40% is gonna be renewable and 60%, it's all based on economic variables that, are gonna be associated with cost and productivity, that I don't think we should even be prescribing. As long as it's economic to develop with appropriate environmental safeguards, better sources of energy, we should. But it's gonna be, it'll be descriptive or it'll be a fait accompli to me rather than a prescriptive percentage of various sources.
I'll hold off on the second part then.
Yeah, I think we've used our time, but thank you very much, Brian.
you.
I
Appreciate
Jim, for your talk, and maybe we'll go back to you with a few questions in the future.
Okay.
Excellent. So our last talk during our open session today is on wave and tidal energy development. Our speakers, Brian Palaji, University of Washington, and Joe Crudell of Sea Power. So I apologize, Brian, for the delay, but we're ready.
Yeah, do you want me to go first or Joe to go first?
I leave it up to you.
Go for it, Brian.
Suggestions?
You go first, Brian.
Yeah, I have your PowerPoint.
Oh, great.
Well,
let's just do that one. Share it.
Huh?
You just want to share it?
Yeah, that works.
Okay, that works great, yeah. I plug in Clicker to advanced slides.
Okay.
Avoid creating a technical problems. Yes, okay, great. Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to come and talk to you a little bit about tidal energy today and give a bit of an overview of the technology. So I'm Dr. Brian Palaji. I'm a professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Washington. I've been working in the marine energy space since about 2005. I was involved in the initial tidal energy feasibility studies that were conducted by EPRI in North America, and then was involved with the Pacific Marine Energy Center for a number of years, and now just back at a regular faculty appointment. So I'm going to give you a bit of a whirlwind overview, and I have some direction from the committee about things you're interested in seeing. So I'm going to try to cover all of those. I probably won't get them all, and we'll have some time in the Q&A to cover what I don't get to. So a couple of characteristics of tidal currents. The big one that distinguishes tidal currents from other sources of renewable generation is their predictability. Once you have characterized the tidal energy site, you can forecast down to kind of like 5 to 10 minute scale accuracy what the currents are going to be doing decades in advance. And so it's still a variable form of generation, and it's an intermittent form of generation, but it's a highly predictable form of generation. Currents that are sufficient to generate power are only going to occur in relatively narrow channels. And by relatively, I mean, it's got to be small compared to what's surrounding it. So the Pentland Firth in the UK, 25 kilometers wide, that is relatively small compared to the Atlantic Ocean. In Puget Sound, 5 kilometers wide in Admiralty Inlet is relatively narrow compared to the Straits of Juan de Fuca in the main basin. The currents are also tend to be augmented by headlands. So as the flow goes around a landmass, you'll get some local acceleration potentially. The other note here is that the highest speeds are closest to the surface. This plot is showing the distance from the seabed on the vertical axis, the speed of the currents on the horizontal, and this is basically going up in the water column. And so from a standpoint of where you want to put a tidal turbine, you can put them anywhere in the water column, but the higher you go in the water column, the more energetic the currents will be.
Zoom's not getting what we're getting up here.
Is there?
Are you getting it?
Yep.
I'm sorry, pardon me.
Okay.
Excuse me, pardon me for.
Okay, I was afraid I was going to start over on that.
Okay.
But so higher in the water column is generally better. The other thing I want to note here is that the speeds that you see at tidal current sites, typically for a good economic site, you're going to be looking for peak currents up to about 3 meters per second. There are not a lot of those locations globally. It tends to be a very patchy resource. So it's a very energetic resource, it's a very predictable resource, but it is patchy. So I wanted to highlight a couple of the technologies here. So the first one I'm looking at is the Atlantis Resources AR 1500. I would describe this as a technology if you said, you know what, wind has it all sorted, I just want a wind turbine underwater.
So this turbine basically sits on a gravity foundation on the seabed. It's one of the, it's a component of the largest array of tidal turbines that's currently operating in the world, which is 4 turbines, which is to say this is a very early stage technology. Relatively small rotor diameter, about 18 meters, tiny compared to wind, but the higher density of water makes up for that in terms of a rated power of 1.5 megawatts. That's not as large as an offshore wind turbine, but it's competitive with what we see for conventional wind. System sits on the seabed with a gravity anchor, incorporates most of the control strategies you'd see on a modern wind turbine. And if you want to recover this to the surface, you can disconnect the nacelle at this point, come out of the water, come onto a vessel, be serviced, go back in. This style of turbine has been operating for about 6 years now in the Pentland Firth of the UK. There's another phase of the project that's going forward, I guess in the next year or two, which will expand it to about 90 turbines. The major limitation with this strategy is, like I said, the currents are stronger, higher in the water column, you want to go up. But if you've got a gravity foundation and this rotor hub height is going higher and higher, if you don't make the foundation really heavy, the turbine will literally tip over. So there are some limiting factors in terms of how these can be deployed. So that's the AR 1500. The other one that's, let's see if we're, oops. Okay, good. The other one that's relatively new technology, and this one I think is one that says, like, you know what, wind had it almost entirely right, but let's remember the fact that we're actually in water, buoyancy applies. This is the Orbital Marine Power O2 turbine. So the water line on the turbine, the water line in the hull, so there's a hull system that sits on top of the water. The wings then go down under the water when it's in a power generating mode. Little bit larger turbine than the AR 1500. Rated power is a bit higher because there's a pair of rotors, not a single rotor. It's a moored turbine, which, as we're going to see in a little bit, has some pros and cons. A lot of the same strategies for control that you'd see in offshore wind or onshore wind. And then for maintenance, you retract the wings up to the surface and you can tow the system back into shore to be maintained. So this is one that is effectively taking a lot of what we've learned from wind and saying, let's continue to apply that, but let's try to acknowledge that we're in the ocean as well. This is a system that's been tested at the European Marine Energy Center for a number of years, but hasn't been rolled out commercially yet. And I'm happy to take questions that are going, by the way. Okay, I wanted to just do a quick power generation fundamentals here. So top plot here is showing the probability of currents occurring as a function of the current speed. So this would be like, you go out to a site, you make measurements for 90 days or maybe a year if you're very lucky. You look at the fraction of the time a given current will occur. It's generally going to be left skewed. So at least on the West Coast, slower currents are going to be more common. And the way this practically represents itself, and I think gets to one of the committee members' questions a little bit about wind, is in terms of the control action that a tidal turbine will take. So vertical axis here is power output, horizontal axis is current speed. So initially, the currents are going to be a little bit too slow to generate any power, so the turbine's not going to put anything out. You're going to get to a cut-in speed of about 0.7 meters per second, maybe about 2 knots. At that point, the turbine's going to start producing power. That power is going to go with the cube of the current speed. So it's going to ramp up really quickly. It's one of the reasons that you need relatively high currents. After a time, you're going to reach this point, what's called the rated speed, where the turbine will start actually intentionally becoming less efficient. It will start outputting a constant amount of power, even as the power in the currents continues to ramp up. That may seem like a really odd idea, but it's just economics, because past this point, you're getting into relatively low probability of occurrence. And if you were to try to efficiently harness the currents at these higher speeds, you'd end up massively oversizing your turbines. And so you'd be paying for a lot of capacity that's rarely used, which would be quite uneconomic. The designs that I have seen to date for tidal energy typically are going to be targeting a rated speed that's site specific. That means that on average, the turbine is going to be putting out 30 to 40% of its rated power on average. So it's a good kind of working number to have in your head. Okay, I mentioned the orbital turbine. There's the turbine and then there's the mooring. So this is taken from Orbital's filings for regulatory measures for the European Marine Energy Center. The platform itself on the surface is about 80 meters long. These are the 22 diameter meter rotors on the sides here. But then there's a relatively large footprint, 400 meters by 200 meters on edge, that accommodates the moorings. The moorings themselves are a little over 200 meters in length. They're held down on the seabed by gravity foundations, 11 meters by 11 meters, weighted with a lot of steel. The way this works is that if the currents, say, are going this way, these two legs of the mooring will be in tension. These two will be relatively slack. So the moorings have a section of chain about 100 meters that stays in the seabed continuously. And then there's a riser cable that comes up to the platform. When the currents shift, the other side's riser cables are going to set down on the seabed and the other sides will go into tension. Now, what this means is that you can't just stack these right next to each other, right? You end up with overlapping moorings. So this is an approach that takes, in some ways, better use of the marine environment by not just relying on gravity to hold it in place, but it does mean that it requires more of a footprint per turbine. Okay, I want to transition to some environmental considerations. So I'm going to not give you the full laundry list of possible environmental effects of tidal energy, as it's been the subject of a number of different workshops and reports. But the three main ones that come up and the ones that I'll do a bit of a deep dive into are collision risk. So obviously the risk of injury or mortality is something that's very unique for tidal turbines in the marine environment. The noise they produce and the potential to influence animal behavior, and then the potential for displacement as a consequence of that noise. So these are all active research areas. I'll give you a very quick snippet of what that looks like. Some other effects, habitat. Obviously, if you set things on the seabed or you have objects in the water that marine life can colonize, it will. The changes to habitat are going to be relatively limited for quote unquote small arrays. So this has not been an area of a lot of investigation. Mostly it's this along the lines of, if we understand habitat, but we don't understand collision, that still doesn't really allow the technology to move forward in a meaningful way. The other one that's come up several times is entanglement. If I'm looking at the O2 turbine in particular, the mooring lines on that are actually a fairly heavy chain. So direct entanglement, there's limited possibilities for that. There's always the possibility of ghost fishing, but ghost fishing off of those chains, probably not more plausible than ghost fishing off of a different kind of mooring. So not a unique aspect of tidal energy. Okay, so if we think about collision, which is the one that kind of comes to mind for the most part, in some sense, collision risk is very easy to assess. It's just three factors. You have to understand the likelihood that animals will be present, the likelihood that they're going to encounter the turbine, and the severity of collision. Unfortunately, we know very little about any three of those things. So from a likelihood of animal presence, there's a seasonal interannual variation that's going to be species specific. We look at likelihood of encounter. So if an animal is present in the area, why is it going to encounter a turbine or not? And we end up with certain questions like, will the noise from the turbine cause animals to avoid it? And there's some work that a colleague in Europe did back in 2017 that was playing back noise from a turbine and found that seals generally try to avoid the turbine to a range of about 500 meters. But as these turbines are in the water, especially something like the AR-1500 with that foundation that's going to turn into a reef and starts to attract prey, are animals going to be attracted to the turbines because of the prey aggregation? And then seals have phenomenal hearing. Will they actually be attracted to the noise once they understand that that noise means food? And so this becomes a coupled question that's actually quite difficult to answer. From a collision severity standpoint, there's the question of evasion. When an animal gets close to a turbine, how quickly can it get away? And it really depends on the animal, it depends on the turbine, it depends on the water currents. And then the question of collision severity, how fast can a rotor be turning before it becomes a risk to an animal, right? If we say a stationary rotor is not a risk, something that's moving at, say, the speed of a vessel prop, which is not how fast tidal turbines rotate, that would be a major risk. Where's the line in between there? So we don't know the answer to most of these questions. In the US, we've done a little bit of pre-installation study on the likelihood of animal presence, but the big questions, this really is mostly a post-installation question. It's very difficult to answer these in a satisfying way without having objects that you can actually study. And I would argue that even the question of presence is a lot easier to do post-installation because now you have a power cable going to your turbine. You can run sensors on a much higher duty cycle. You can run higher power sensors than you could with batteries. So again, I think post-installation is really where a lot of this gets resolved. So speaking of post-installation, we'll go back to the Maygen project. This is the AR-1500 turbine specifically. And I'm looking at some results here that were put together by some colleagues in the UK at Sea Mammal Research Unit. Sea Mammal Research Unit, SMRU. So this is data from an active sonar that they put down on the AR-1500 turbine. They were looking at seal presence in the area. You might say harbor seals. Like, why is this like what they spent all their time working on? Well, for those who aren't familiar, in the UK, harbor seals are basically southern resident killer whales. They're a critically endangered population. They're a species of exceptional concern, and that's where most of the effort for monitoring gets placed. So this is looking at animal change in presence as a function of current speed in the vicinity of the AR 1500 turbine. This is looking at kind of at a range of tens of meters around the turbine. And what you see is at lower current speeds, animals are basically present around the turbine, but as the currents ramp up, presence can drop by up to 70% once you get to the highest current speeds, which means that that risk of avoidance is actually somewhat correlated with the outcome of a collision severity. So there's some interesting findings there. If you look further afield, SMRU tagged about 50 individual seals to understand where they were using the Pentland Firth. So these little squares here are where the turbines are actually located. The colors are showing the estimated percentage difference in seal utilization of areas pre and post installation. Dark blues are reduced utilization. The yellows are higher utilization. This is a very pretty plot, but only these areas with minuses and these areas with pluses are actually statistically significant differences. So they saw about a 25% drop in seal utilization on this side of the island where the turbines are, but a 25% increase to the other side. So there were still seals in the area, but their use of the area was changing. And the scale here, this area is about 2 kilometers in radius. So the question would be, well, is there something that's actually causing seals to avoid these turbines out to a range of 2 kilometers? And as mentioned previously, seals have phenomenal hearing. And this is a very busy plot taken from some work by Denise Risch that surveyed the noise that's produced by the AR 1500. So I'll try to walk you through this. Vertical axis is third octave band levels. That's an indication of sound intensity. Horizontal axis is the frequency of sound. Seals, very good hearing at low frequencies up to kind of tens of kilohertz. So almost all the sound that you're seeing here would be audible to a seal. The gray lines are ambient measurements. These are measurements that were taken before the turbines were installed. The dotted lines are the 5th to 95th percentile, so relatively wide range here. And then the colored bars are sound measured when the turbine was operating. This is a range of about 100 meters from the turbine. So the turbine's producing a fair bit of sound from about 50 hertz to about 2 kilohertz. That's going to be mostly mechanical noise, so sounds from bearings, from rotary seals, generators, gearboxes, that sort of thing. And then up about 20 kilohertz, there's additional electrical noise. This is not electrical exactly. This is the way the turbine is controlled. The generator windings vibrate at about 20 kilohertz, and that vibration propagates into the water. So this is what a seal would hear when the currents are doing about 1 to 2 meters per second. Now, as the currents ramp up, you actually see this ambient noise floor kind of collapses with the turbine noise floor. The turbine noise doesn't actually change very much. It's just that ambient noise is going up because you have more cobbles and pebbles basically colliding together on the seabed, producing high frequency noise. And so there's not much variation in terms of how the turbine sound changes as the currents change. There's some variations in ambient noise, but what it means on average is that these low frequencies, that's audible to a range of about 2.3 kilometers, which basically lines up with exactly the displacement that the folks were seeing in the studies of seal behavior within the overall Pentland Firth. Okay, that was a whirlwind, but to kind of summarize here, in terms of collision and noise summary, all the effort that's been spent to date trying to look at collision, no one has observed collision involving a marine mammal and a turbine. We've seen some interactions, mostly with the rotors shut down. The avoidance ranges can be significant, so from a displacement perspective, that's something to be considering. However, there's a lot of opportunities to reduce that acoustic footprint. The AR 1500 turns out to be substantially louder than the other turbines in the Maygen array, and a lot of it comes down to how its drivetrain is engineered. So opportunities to reduce that footprint and really tailor that avoidance. You want a little bit of avoidance, but not too much. And going forward for the next stage of Maygen, which is another 90 turbines, the plan is to really focus on displacement and how to study it, because that's really kind of where the environmental questions are landing these days. So that's Tidal Energy in a nutshell. Happy to answer other questions as we have time and interest. So thanks.
Are there any questions now? We'll also open the floor for general questions.
So Orbital Science has said that they haven't detected any collision, but the likelihood of a decision, they've got cameras and I think they have sensors.
Mostly sonars. The water quality in the Pentland Firth is low enough that optical is not a great technology.
Do you think that, and that's been used by Alpalco to defend their application up in Rosario Strait. Do this is an application to install a large OS2 turbine structure up there. Do you think their justification is sound for there not having been any collisions? It's okay to say that there haven't been any detected, but the greatest threat is either offshore where we are concerned with or else in the Sailor Sea is a rotor impacting a southern resident killer whale.
Of course.
And I've calculated it spins about 35 miles an hour in the outer tip of that rotor at the maximum velocity. That's pretty fast and in dark water. So that's what's got to convince the population that it's safe to put these things out there. I mean, I'm just curious what your thoughts are about that.
I mean, I think that there's been a lot of effort around studying the collision encounter risks with porpoise and with seals around the AR-1500. It's not a replacement for, you can't say it's a one-to-one port over between that and a southern resident, obviously. I think that if that project was to move forward, the important part would be to monitor that project appropriately to understand what the risks are. I'll say one of the, when thinking about collision risk, often, I'm glad you pointed out the speed of the rotor tip, not the rotation rate, because that really, the relative speed is what's important, right? And so if you look out at the tip of the blade, that's where the speed's highest, but that's also where the rotor solidity is lowest. And if you go into the rotor base, the speed is relatively low, but the physical space occupied by the rotor is high. So it's really that kind of mid-range of the blade span that's probably the greatest risk. The good news is that's actually easier to monitor than going out to the blade tips, because you know your range of your optical and acoustic equipment is somewhat limited. So
That makes sense. Yeah. Thank you.
We have a question from Annette.
Hi, Brian. Annette Monjuan here. Very good presentation. Thank you very much. My question is, what do you foresee as far as future development of tidal off the West Coast?
So that's a great question. And if I had a crystal ball on the economics of tidal energy, I'd be able to answer it more effectively. I mean, really, right now, the primary areas where tidal is being developed are Puget Sound and Cook Inlet, and that's where there's interest. There's different trade-offs and different factors in both locations. Both areas, it's in some way motivated by energy resiliency and security of supply. It's just a question of at what point the economics of tidal starts to really compete with the other possibilities in those areas. And until those initial demonstration projects are in the water and we understand the economics, it's very difficult to answer that question. So I would love to have the answer to that, but I don't.
No worries. That was good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a good answer, actually.
It's an honest one.
Yeah.
What about fouling? How do they have to be pulled out to have the barnacle scrape out?
So it depends on what part you want to protect on the rotors. So the rotary surfaces are generally protected with anti-fouling paint, just like anything else that you put in the water where hydrodynamic drag is important. The Magen turbines, I think, have been out of the water roughly once a year for cleaning and inspection. I don't know if that's a normal cycle for those. Again, I know they had a number of electrical problems. It's a prototype array, so the number of maintenance interventions is probably a little bit higher than you'd like to see in the long run. I know we tested a very small turbine in swim about a year ago and treated the blades with a coating called Clear Signal, and the blades basically came out of the water looking like they went in. The rest of the foundation, less so.
Okay, seeing no further questions at the moment, let's move on to Joe with Sea Power.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Annette, for inviting me to join this committee, and thank you, Brian, for the title portion of this. I'm sure you can help me chime in if there's environmental questions. My name is Joe Pradell. I've been in ocean wave energy research now for about 23 years. I started with Dr. Fanjuan at Oregon State University many years ago, long before there was actually any funding for any of this. So it's been a fantastic career of research and development. And most recently, I'm still at Sea Power as the director of Oregon operations, and I head the electrical engineering group. So I will step through the slides here as quickly as possible. I'm going to give a little agenda first. We're going to go into the background of Sea Power, kind of briefly, a technology overview of sort of where we're at today with our Sea Ray autonomous power systems, a little bit about the PackWave deployment, highlight some of our technology developments, and then try to possibly answer some of the questions along the way. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Sea Power. So Sea Power started many years ago, actually at Oregon State University. We've been around for quite some time. We have the offices in Charlottesville, Virginia is where our corporate office is. We have about 4 dedicated corporate and a board. Corvallis, Oregon is still where our engineering group is. We have 11 or 12 engineers, depending on what day of the week it is, and how many people are participating, and a very expanded crew of people that we work with, universities, NREL, Department of Energy, APL, UW. It's been a pleasure to work with many different groups over the years. Decades of engineering, modeling, testing, a lot of ocean experience. Myself, I'm an ex-Navy person, a surfer. I've spent my entire life in the water. When we deploy these things, we're out there with it. We do a lot of the deployments ourselves. These are purpose-built technologies where we're trying to essentially now seeing a need and meeting that need. It's important to realize that, that other there's $30 million from the Department of Energy. The current ocean economy is somewhere in like 2.5 trillion worldwide. It's an enormous ocean economy, and there are many uses for having power and data in the middle of the ocean, anywhere in the ocean. And that's really what we're looking at. It's to try to get through this qualification for our prototype to get a certified commercial product, move forward with many of the patents we have. You see, we have over 50 patents worldwide, and we're on that commercialization path. So going right ahead, this is sort of our overview. This is a cartoon, but it kind of gives a brief understanding of how we look at integrating with the economy of these autonomous power systems. First, important systems like data gathering, robotics, AUVs, RUVs, the other many different applications, eventually unmanned surface systems, surveillance, what else? And eventually the electrical grid. And fortunately, other systems like offshore wind and tidal have been sort of, breaking ground in that direction. And we get to ride a little bit on the coattails of offshore grid integration with that. And even in technologies like hybrid electric vehicles for these smaller units, a lot of the 25 years ago, we might have not had the power electronics or the high grade, torque motors we do today to be able to have efficient power conversion systems at this smaller Sea Ray scale. So let's see if I can get the slide to change. Here we go. Whoops, too fast. Move my fingers too quickly. Touchy mouse. I had an animation here, but let's see if it works. Shows a little bit of our current Oregon Sea Ray system modeling. We do a lot of extensive modeling and integration, including all our hydrodynamics, structural analysis, all our power electronics. Everything on it is, a unique part, I would say. Very few parts that are commercial off the shelf. We try to integrate commercial off the shelf parts, but it's for pulse power, it's fairly difficult to do. And this is sort of the overview of an autonomous power system. And the top portion, the Sea Ray, is the wave power unit, which most people are familiar with as a wave energy converter. That wave power unit provides power to onboard battery storage and provides power to the subsea base unit, which is a gravity anchor, but it also primarily acts as an energy storage unit and a way to store power and take data off the seafloor. So we have essentially 3 points in this system where we can either provide data or power connection. If you want to be in the mid column, we have a way to do that also. Going right ahead, if we can get this to go right ahead. A little bit of what we're looking at for these autonomous systems is essentially being able to support the industry in the ocean. And right now we have environmental commercial sensors out there learning how to, that want to be able to have real-time data and power, year round. So this is a system that can be installed to do that. No more, bringing out, liquid energy in the form of gasoline or diesel to power something or having to bring out new batteries. This system can be installed and work You know, our initial lifespan is somewhere in the service interval of, 5 years, looking at trying to get to 20. There's obviously some questions about that and biofouling. So there's all these questions, how long can we actually go before we need a service interval? But with these types of systems, they may be only there part-time, in a temporary installation to support operations. You have operating equipment, RUVs, which you might want to have, in some circumstances, you would have like a vessel operating with an RV stationed in a particular location for a long period of time. You could do a deployment like this and support an RV essentially indefinitely throughout the year or years until that particular operation is complete. Security sensors are very important these days. One of the coolest things is that I'm an engineer, obviously, is the integration of subsea robotics, being able to set up charging stations to be able to download data and then get that real-time data upload to the cloud. Being able to provide these services of real-time data for any of these types of applications is, I think, huge. And this kind of, I think, in the ocean industry, ocean economy, this real-time revolution of being able to have real-time data in the ocean is so important, I think. And I think we're in the data age now. It's past the internet age. I think we're in the, data collection, everything's on the cloud. So, and let's go to the next slide. We have some more pictures to show sort of the history of how we got here. We've done quite a bit of research over the years on the hydrodynamics. Excuse me, real quick. We started with APL on a DARPA tuna project, looking at how to do small scale deployable power systems that would be a temporary platform to power whatever it may be that you want to power, offshore and have a low profile. From there, we went to the Tiger Ray with the U.S. Navy in 2022. This is also a fairly small unit. We're looking at fairly small payloads. That system continued to develop in 2023 and 2025 or 4, I believe, 4. In parallel with that, we developed a slightly larger scale device, which we would call the Sea Ray. The original Sea Ray AOPS or Aloha Sea Ray, which we deployed in off the Oregon coast. We recovered that last year. We were able to test all our systems and charge a subsea energy storage. I believe it was the first ever time that a subsea energy storage was charged by a wave energy converter in the United States. And I believe actually in 2008, we were the first to produce electrical power with the L10 off the Oregon coast some years ago. So many firsts for sea power over the years. Kind of a fun development. We're always changing. I think the one thing that's very unique about our engineering team is we're not afraid of change. I think it's the only thing that we have that's consistent. We're always looking for the best solution for the application. So whatever that application may be. Here in the near future, we're looking at an 18-month deployment at PacWave. We have a few details to work through on that in the coming year. With the hopes to having a longer deployment, I would like to, but I think that our new, which we have an Oregon class K2 plus Sea Ray, has a much, I would say a better resilience to many of the fault techniques that we had in the past, because we're getting away from prototype type power electronics. We're going to industrial power electronics. We work with many suppliers like Vicor and other systems to have and also have a SCADA system that has the real-time diagnostics. So if we do have a fault, we have initial fault recovery, much more resilient system, as here says, a hardened design system, improved communications, and improved IO&M. So the system will last, as a commercial, looking at going into commercial production. Here's a fantastic imagery put forth by SIA. Thanks to them, we're testing a payload here to see if we can do pump actuation, and it has an acoustic modem. This has a great graphics of our Verloom subsea energy storage container. This is essentially a 1 TU clump weight mooring that we're able to moor our system off of. That's just a really more advanced way of seeing it. There's also an animation, I think, that goes with this, but this looks pretty nice. Moving right ahead to applications. So along the way, during the entire time of all the different research projects, we've been looking at this, how do we get a certified unit? Because we know going to commercial, whether you're going grid integrated or an offshore system, you'll need to have a certified unit, something that people can invest in and they understand it has been de-risked. So for many years, we've been working with DNV. We have a member of group that works with the ICE TC114 for wave energy converters. We follow the 62600 marine energy system design requirements. From there are a number of different requirements when you really read through that that you can look at that tells you essentially overall encompassing criteria of how the system should build. But many of these, as you can see with the new technology, when we first got started, many of these standards weren't there. We're kind of adopting standards from wind energy, from offshore floating platforms, even from the AIP, petroleum industry, to try to ensure that we're meeting all the required standards for any of these applications moving forward. So a little bit of our qualification process for the C-Ray. We've gone through the initial qualification basis, have done a technology assessment, the novelty of the obstacles, and then went into a risk assessment and FEMCA to kind of a failure mode and risks to see what are the critical system components that could potentially fail in any application, and try to reiterate on those designs and do an improvement to de-risk the entire system design. And that's everything from mooring to subsea energy storage to power electronics to paints to anything, nuts and bolts and corrosion. So that qualification plan is sort of where we've gone most recently, and we're currently in pre-execution of the plan to collect the evidence. This is deploying the C-Ray with the subsea energy storage and doing an extended deployment. As you can see, the statement of feasibility was issued in December of 2024. I made this presentation a little short because I realized we were running short on time, but I hope I have a lot of room for questions. Yeah, question, go. I don't know how to answer questions, but go right ahead.
Yeah, I think Annette has a question. Or a
Yes,
comment.
thank you very much. Joe, great presentation, very exciting. Question about your power range plans. How high do you plan to scale this up, and what rating do you plan to test at PackWave?
That's a great question. Power ratings are a difficult thing to come across, specifically in wave energy, because it's pulsed, right? And so a lot of people wonder, what is your generator rated at? What is your output rated at? And so us coupled with energy storage, we have a wide variety of things that we can produce power levels. It just has to depend how long can you produce that? Because really what we're looking at is how much energy are we extracting out of the ocean and how fast can we dissipate it? If we have a continuous load, I say we're limited closer to no more than the 2 to 5 kilowatt range on a lot of these. And this has to do with just the scale of that if you're looking at powering something continuously, right? But many of the loads in the ocean are really not on continuous. Pumps run intermittently. A lot of the sonar arrays, there's this temporary charging. So that's where we're coupling it with subsea energy storage. Our device itself, we bring in pulse power, up into the 20 to 40 kilowatt range on either side, but those pulses are really instantaneous, compared to your normal energy. We output right now somewhere between 5 and 10. This particular C-Ray, I have the potential to push it past 12 if I wanted to. I think I'm going to keep it around 10, just because it's a prototype. So 10 kilowatt output. But like I said, once you have the energy on board, coupled with energy storage, with modern power electronics, as you know, Vanjuan, it's like the sky's the limit. What do you want to power, and how long do you need to power it? And that's sort of how we approach that problem. If you have a pump, even if you have a 100 kilowatt pump, maybe you don't need to run it continuously. Maybe you need to run it 10 times a week, and that's something that could be done.
Have you stated capacity factors?
No, so that's back to the capacity factor, like the wind question earlier. What's the capacity factor in offshore wind, which is usually 25 to 50%, depending on the location. You know, it really varies. And capacity factor, as you with offshore wind, if you integrate that with wave energy, like wave energy integrated to the grid could be fairly high because there's always waves present. So if you take the capacity factor from looking at what the output is, we have a fairly high capacity factor. Usually it's between 40 to 50% compared to rating. Like I said, that's why I said we're at 10 and maybe we can push 5, and sometimes we're only pushing 2, but it really depends on the climate, like I said. So this is very site specific information, like what is your average power? You really have to say, where are you in the ocean? And then do the analysis, and then I'll tell you how much energy we can have at that particular location.
Very good. Thank you. I want to leave others to have a chance for questions as well.
Sure.
Yeah, are there any further questions for either speaker? Yeah, so I'd like to thank you both for presenting to us, and that's the end of our open session for today, so we take a 5-minute break before going into it.
All right, thanks again.